Okay, let's get started with class 2 here. So we want to talk about the next passage type, and that is going to be experiment and data presentation. Okay, and the main feature of these passage types is that they're going to focus on showing you some type of experiment and describing to you what happens in the experiment and the type of data that were collected with regard to that experiment that was performed. And one of the features that stand out that you can use to identify these passages is that there's data that's actually in figures. All right, so this is where you see nice graphs or figures or tables that have all the data points from the experiment. So that's one of the first features that you should look for and what makes it easier to identify these types of passages. So data in figures or graphs or tables. All right, so that's experiment data presentation passages. Out of the physics passages that you're going to see, these are the second most common. Okay, after information presentation, which we looked at last class. It turns out, in addition to being the second most common, that this is also the one that sort of allows for the most overlap with biology and with the other sciences. So most overlap. So you're likely to see maybe a passage here where it integrates different subjects, perhaps chem or perhaps some biological situation. So there's the most overlap. This is simply because data presentation tends to be more similar across subjects than perhaps something like information presentation where you might have a lot of equations, and that's something that's sort of more unique to physics, and it allows for less overlap with the other subjects. Okay, if we look at our grid, right, so I put our grid up here for how to help us identify the different passage types. We see that with experiment and data presentation, it's more on the subtle end. Right, so it involves a deep dive to try to figure out what's going on, and a lot more towards the technical and numerical. Okay, so it's going to detail the steps of an experiment, perhaps. It's going to tell us how the experiment was conducted, and then that numerical aspect where we get data points, again, usually in figures, graphs, or tables within the passage. Okay, so this is how you identify this passage type. Now, what do you do about actually tackling it? All right, so you get to passage 8 on the MCAT, you realize it's an experiment data presentation type. What does this mean? What does this imply for you as the test taker when you're mapping, doing your highlighting and doing your scratch paper? So let's start with highlighting. In terms of highlighting, it is going to be pretty similar. All right, so what did we say are important things to highlight based on what we talked about last class? Italics, yes, definitely. Italics. Reversals. Keep going. What else have we been talking about? Definitions, right? Definitions. Numbers. Familiar words, right? Alright, so all those things carry over from what we talked about last class. Extreme language, thank you. Extreme language is also in there. Causal, right? So all those things carry over. The one place where you're likely to see more of in this passage type, and that's going to be unique to this passage type, is you're going to want to pick out what the purpose of the experiment is. They're presenting an experiment, so usually they're going to tell you, probably towards the beginning, what they're trying to figure out. What are they trying to test for? Why are they conducting this experiment? So the purpose of the experiment is something that's unique to this, and also something that's really important, right? So you want to know why they're doing this, because that could come up later in a conceptual question in the passage, and it will help guide the discussion as to why these researchers or these scientists wanted to do this experiment in the first place. Okay, so you should label this in your notes because this is important, and this is the part that's unique to this passage type. You're going to highlight the purpose of the experiment. All right, so we've done our highlighting. Now, what about scratch paper? Okay, again, there are certain things that you're always going to do on your scratch paper, right? So what do we need the scratch paper to include? Yeah, so you got to have your passage number. You got to have your question range. Okay, if there is a figure that describes that shows you a situation and it's simple, what do? You draw it, yeah. So draw or redraw simple figures. Yes, I heard someone say rewrite equations, absolutely. Okay, so this is a kind of a nice review from what we talked about last class. So you're going to rewrite any equations that you see. Redraw it if it's simple. If you think of any equations from memory that you think might apply to the situation, you write those down. So equations from memory that are applicable, of course, to the situation. All right, so that's your scratch paper. So we've identified that this is an experiment data presentation. We know what to expect and what to look for within the passage. So we know how to highlight, we know how to do the scratch paper. Now the next thing here is what question types are we likely to see? All right, what question types are we likely to see here? So for each of the question types, what do we know about experiment presentation passages for those question types? A lot of questions take the form of if you changed some input, what would happen to the output? Okay, so if you change something about one of these research scenarios and changed what you put in, whether it be a value or you made some conceptual change, someone moved from outside, the outside part of a rotation further inside, or we took a satellite and we moved it away from the Earth. So what happens if we change something about the scenario? What does that imply about the results of the experiment? So the format might go, if you changed input X, what happens to output Y? Okay? So that's a common sort of question format that you should look out for on experiment data presentation passages. All right, now let's go through each of the three question types. So starting with implicit, okay, the one that involves the most analysis. What do implicit questions look like for this passage type? It's going to ask you to do something with the experimental procedure, right? So you want to evaluate the experimental procedure often by applying outside knowledge. So by taking something that you know to be true relative to that subtopic in physics, what does that say about the experimental procedure? Okay, so evaluate or analyze the experimental procedure using outside knowledge. All right, what about explicit? What about explicit? Sometimes this is going to just involve reading numbers, right? So knowing where to look in the table for numbers, and then maybe doing some simple calculation with those numbers or some plug and chug calculation with the numbers that you got. So knowing where to look, right? And this might involve knowing, okay, I need to look at row 3, column 4 of the numerical table for the specific number that they're looking at based on the parameters that they provided in the question stem. All right, so reading off numbers and knowing where to look is important here. All right, you might also have to extrapolate values, all right? So figure out if something is going in a direction, so if this doubles, what's gonna happen to this other value based on the equation in the numerical table. So extrapolate values and trends. Okay, so that's a common sort of format for explicit questions. All right, memory, finally. Okay, these could require outside knowledge of either some outside situation and applying it to an equation or a definition. Okay, so apply outside knowledge to equation or definition. Another situation for memory. Maybe you have to take this outside knowledge that you apply to equation or definition and maybe add one term from the passage. All right, so that's where the passage mapping and understanding where to look for this number is important. All right, any questions on that? Any questions on that? All right, sounds good. So this is experiment data presentation.